Hey everybody, this is Jake with P3. In this video tutorial, we're going to walk you through all the processes on your V3 gauge. This is similar to other gauges, but this video specifically is just for the V3 gauge itself. So whether you're a dealer offering tech support to a customer or an end user using the gauge in your car, this video will help you walk through the entire configuration menu, all the controls and all the functions of your V3 gauge. So we've got our Camaro here, we've got the gauge installed. Let's go ahead and get started accessing the gauge. One thing to note is that when you're accessing the config menu in your gauge, you don't have to have your engine running and you don't even have to have the ignition turned on. I've got my keys right here in the cup holder, not even in the ignition, and I have constant power at the OBD2 port. So as long as you've got your gauge plugged into the OBD2 port or hardwired to a constant power source, you can just hold both buttons until CO and F pops up and then release. And now we're in config menu even without the engine running. The first thing we want to go over on the gauge are your controls. Now, if the engine is off like it is now, neither of the buttons are going to do anything other than holding both of them together. And if we hold them both together until CO and F pops on the screen, now we're in the configuration mode. So now that you're in config mode, the right button is going to cycle through the settings and the left button will adjust the setting that you're currently on. So we can see on our first reading here, after we've entered config mode, we didn't touch anything. The screen automatically changes to DTC, and that stands for Diagnostic Trouble Code. This gauge is only going to read P codes, which are powertrain codes, and it can do some manufacturer-specific codes, such as BMWs. But on this first setting, if we tap the left button, it's going to try and display the codes to you. And right now, we get a message, and we can do this again, that says turn on car, and that's because the ignition is off. Right now, the gauge is on because it has 12 volts, but your PCM or your ECM, ECU, whatever you want to call it, that's not powered up, so the gauge is not able to communicate with that. So if we put our ignition, our key in the ignition, turn the key on, now we'll go ahead and tap the left button. And you can see that it says no codes. I'll do that again. No code, and that's because we don't have any codes right now. So I'll turn it back off so we can get rid of the GM door alarm. If you want to clear codes, if you have codes and you want to clear them, you would tap the left button and it's going to read you the codes. If we want to clear the codes, we will hold the left button down and it'll say hold. You'll keep holding until that disappears. Then you'll see some dots go across the screen and then it says CLRD for cleared. That's also going to exit you out of the config menu anytime you clear codes. So let's go ahead and hold both buttons to jump back in. Config. And so we've got DTC. We've gone over our first setting. So the second setting is going to be your boost setting. Your boost setting is going to have plenty of different variables. It's going to be BST dot and then a variable. Right now, it defaults to boost D, which is going to be reading boost through the OBD2 port using a map sensor on the intake manifold. There's a ton of different settings here, and we can go through those by tapping the left button, and we can see that we've got a bunch of different variables here. And you can look at our config menu chart to see what boost setting you need for your specific vehicle. On this car, which has an LSA, that is going to be boost D. Many of the cars, most of the cars are going to be boost D, and that's just a map sensor on the intake manifold. If we tap the right button to go to the next setting, is analog input number 1, and that's going to be A1.N will be the default for this. This is going to be the brown wire on the main harness of your gauge. If you hook an additional sensor into this gauge, anything with a 0 to 5 volt linear output, so we can do like wideband air fuel ratio, we can do oil pressure, we can do ethanol content, we can do a whole myriad of things. Any sensor with a 0 to 5 volt linear output will work. So we're default on A1.N. We can tap the left button to adjust that to A1.Y. A1.Y is going to allow you to manually input any sensor you tie into this. And all you're going to need to know are the 0 volt value, your low value. So basically, if it's an oil pressure sensor and it's 0 volts is 0 PSI, and then 5 volts is 150 PSI, we can input those numbers into this gauge and it will auto scale everything in between to fill that in. So if we're doing that, we can scroll through here. We've got A1.Y. We're going to tap the right button one time. And it's going to say A1.DP, which means decimal point, so analog 1, decimal point, and then it's going to jump to 4 nines. And you can see as if we push the left button here, the decimal point is just going to move. So we've got 999.9, 99.99, 9.999, depending on what value you're reading, or no decimal point at all. So you have some options there. Once we have our decimal point set up, we'll tap the right button to go to the next setting in there. And this is our value for low. It says A1.low, and then it gives you a value. And right now it's pre-configured for an air-fuel ratio output. So this would be 7.35 parts air to 1 part fuel. And then we tap the right button to go to the next setting. A1.high, which is going to be our high value. That's our 5 volt value. And right now it's pre-configured to 22.39. That's what it's going to default to. And then you can use the left button to change that to whatever value you want. If you tap the left button, you're going to go one value at a time. If you hold the left button down, it's going to scroll through really fast. Next, we tap the right button. We're going to do A1.BL, and that's going to be our bar graph low. That means at what point do we want 0 bars illuminated on the graph? We'll leave that at our low value. A1.BH is the bar graph high. At what value do we want all 10 bars across the top to be illuminated? So that's going to just mimic like a needle sweep. You can just have a visual representation of where you're at in the range of your value. So once we have those set, we go to the right button one more time. And now we're to the A2 setting. So A1 is completely set up at this point. Now we're on A2, which is your second analog input. And this is a good time to go over, we have some pre-configured settings on here. So as you'll notice, this says A2.EC, which means it's pre-configured for our ethanol content. You have some other options as well. FT is fuel temperature. LC is going to be an LC2 wideband for air-fuel ratio. N is no or turned off, as we discussed before. Y is going to be so you can manually configure, just like we did with analog input 1. And now we're back to EC. So these pre-configured outputs or configurations are just so that you don't have to manually put those low and high values in. It's going to be already populated based on the sensor that's connected to it. And this is going to be, again, for the blue wire on your harness. Analog input 1 is brown, analog input 2 is blue. So now we can go to our next setting. Tap the right button. This is our boost unit setting, and right now you can see it's B.PSI. That means boost in pounds per square inch. If we tap the left button, it's going to be B.BAR, so that's boost in bar. So that way you can change the units of just pressure alone. So we'll change back to PSI with the left button. Now we're going to tap the right button to go to the next setting. This is your boost pressure resolution. So right now, PR 0.1 means pressure resolution, and right now we're looking at tenths of an increment. We can change that to round down to the nearest half of an increment, which is 0.5, or we can change it to round down to the nearest whole number increment so you don't get any decimal points. I prefer the 0.1 just because you have the most specific reading, but for those of you that want to see a more rounded number, you can do that right here. So we'll tap the right button to go to the next setting. And this is your shift light. We can see that it says SL.62, and that means shift light dot 6200 RPM. So we just take the first two numbers of the RPM you want your shift light to flash at. And the way the shift light works is whatever RPM we set this to, anytime that your engine reaches that RPM or higher, the gauge will rapidly flash until it drops down below that RPM again. And so once we're on this setting, we can either tap the left button to fine tune that value, or if you hold the left button down, it's going to go super fast and just go right through the menu so you can skip through things. So we'll set this back to 62 using the left button, repeatedly tapping it, and now we're good. So we'll use the right button to go our next setting. And this is our temperature units setting. So right now it's DEG.F, and that means degrees Fahrenheit. If we tap the left button, we can change it to DEG.C, which is degrees Celsius. That way you can change the units of just temperature. You don't have to change all units between imperial and metric. You can do them individually. So we'll change that back to Fahrenheit. Tap the right button to go to the next setting. This is our speed unit setting. And this one, again, we're trying to use abbreviations that make sense, but it's SP.E.Y, and that's speed, English, yes. This is going to be miles per hour. If you tap the left button, it's going to be SP.E.N, which is speed, English, no. So now we're going to be doing kilometers an hour. We can switch back to Y, tap the right button to go to the next setting. This is our speed calibration setting, and so that's SC.0. And basically what we found with developing gauges for all these different makes and model cars, most manufacturers, if not all, will give you on your dash, on your factory cluster, whether it's digital or a needle, your raw value for vehicle speed in the ECU plus a padded percentage will then be your total speed shown on the dash. So let's say your actual speed or your raw speed in the ECU is 55 miles an hour. Typically, you'll see maybe a 5 to 10% addition of speed on your cluster. So if you're doing an actual 50 miles an hour or a raw speed value in the ECU is 50 miles an hour, your display on your cluster may show 55, it may show 57, it may show 60. So we've had customers bring up in the past that the gauge doesn't always match the cluster. Typically, the gauge is always lower than the cluster because the gauge is showing that raw speed, and then your cluster is showing that raw speed plus a percentage added on. And the faster you go, the bigger that number gets because it's a percentage, not a fixed mile per hour or kilometer per hour. So this allows you to either leave it at 0. So we've got speed calibration, and this is going to be percentage points added or taken away from the raw speed to either match your cluster or make your speed whatever you want, however you prefer. If you want to be a little on the safe side, you can make it a little low. Or if you're changing your wheels and tires and you know what your rolling diameter or circumference of that tire is, then you can do the math and change to get to the correct percentage to match the speed that you want to be at. And so on this setting, we would tap the left button and we're going to start adding percent 1 point at a time, all the way up to 20%. We'll buzz up there. And then once you get to 20, let's say you want to do really small wheels and tires. A lot of guys like to do the big offsets, that kind of thing. We've got -9%, and it's going to start counting back up towards 0. So we'll get that back at 0. So that's the speed calibration. Let's tap the right button to go to the next setting. Our next setting is our display dimmer setting. And as you can see here, it defaults to D.on, D.on. This is the default setting, and it means that every time you start your car, the gauge will start in bright mode. Now you can manually dim that while your gauge is running, but then if you shut your ignition off and start the car back up later, it will start back up in bright mode. If we tap the left button, we will see D.on.A, and that stands for automatic dimming. This is going to be using the green wire on your gauge's harness. If you set your gauge to this mode, the gauge is then going to be looking for a signal on that green wire. If that green wire sees 1 or more volts, it will make the display dim. If it sees less than 1 volt, it will leave the display bright. So you're going to run that green wire to any circuit that only gets power when your headlamps are on, and that will make your display automatically dim and turn bright again when the headlamps are turned on and off. One thing to note with the automatic dimming is you cannot manually dim your gauge while it's set to this setting. If we press the left button, we will go to D.on.P, and the P stands for persistent. So in this mode, if you manually dim your gauge, it will always stay dim even if you turn the ignition off or start the car back up. It will always be in dim mode until you manually make the gauge bright again. And we'll tap the right button to go to the next setting. This is your power control option. That's what the PCO stands for. So we've got PCO.A, power control option, automatic. This is the default setting. Right now, the gauge is looking for battery voltage and RPM input to know when to turn on and off. It will not turn on with the ignition. It will not turn on once it's plugged into power. The gauge will power up when it sees a big swing in battery voltage and then RPM input. You may see the blinking dots going across the bottom of the screen, but that just means the gauge is looking just to make sure RPM isn't going. So if we tap the left button, we'll go to the next one. This is PCO.B. So this is power control option button press. So in this mode, your gauge will not turn on automatically with RPM input or battery voltage changes. You'll actually have to physically hold the left button down until the gauge turns on, and then it will stay on until you turn your ignition off. So this just allows you to leave the gauge off if you don't want to turn it on. If somebody else is driving your car, maybe your valet parking your car, something like that, this will leave the gauge off until you physically hold a button to turn it on. If we tap the left button, and so now we can see it says PCO.S, and that's going to be for a switched power source. Some of you out there are building a race car, maybe you don't have an OBD2 port anymore, or you want to just kill power to everything when your ignition is turned off. You can simply cut the red wire on your OBD2 harness and run that to a switched power source. Then the gauge will no longer use logic to look for RPM input or a battery voltage swing to know when to turn on. It will simply just turn on when it has power. So if it's a switched power source, the gauge will be on 100% of the time whenever power is applied. If no power is applied, the gauge will be off. So let's go back to PCO.A. Now we're going to tap the right button to go to the next setting. This is your OBD2 analog setting. It's very straightforward. If it says OBD2, you're in OBD2 mode. The gauge is talking on the network, looking for information that way. If you tap the left button, it will say ANLG, standing for analog. In this mode, the gauge is only concerned with power and ground and the analog inputs. So it can read boost using the analog sensor, the 2 analog inputs, and then it can read battery voltage, obviously from your power source and your ground. So we'll change that back to OBD2. We're gonna tap the right button to go to the next setting. This is your CC setting, and we can see it's defaulted to CC.A. CC stands for car configuration, and that basically just tells the gauge what kind of general car it's connected to, and that will help our software know where to look for information in your ECU. It's going to default to A, but there's a lot of different options there. We can cycle through those. There's A, Y, E, F, H, L, and now we're back to A. This car is an LS powered car, so it's going to need a CC.L. Most cars will be a CC.A, but there's a lot of different unique applications in there. You can check our configuration chart for your specific application. We'll go ahead and push the right button to go to the next setting. This is the low priority mode setting. It's going to default to N for low priority mode, no. Basically what low priority mode is we can cut the refresh rate of the gauge in about half so that it takes up less room on the network and hopefully allows other devices in some cases to work with the gauge on the network at the same time. Most OBD2 devices are not going to work together, but the big thing that this does allow is you can run more than one P3 gauge on your network in most applications at the same time. So low priority mode no means we're running our max refresh rate. We're not cutting the bandwidth down on the gauge or anything like that. If we tap the left button, it'll say LP.Y, which means low priority yes. In this mode, we're cutting the refresh rate of the gauge about in half. So if you're running multiple P3, V3 gauges, you can run one or both in low priority mode, and your eyeballs won't be able to tell the difference in the refresh rate of the information. It's still very quick, but it will allow multiple devices to pull different individual bits of information at the same time. This is your air-fuel ratio unit setting. You can either read it AFR.A, which is air-fuel ratio, so that's going to be your standard 14.7 parts air to 1 part fuel, or if we tap the left button to adjust that, it'll say AFR.L, that's going to be your lambda value. A lot of our customers really requested the lambda, so we went ahead and added that to the output. And this is going to be only for OBD2 information, not if you have an LC2 wideband. The next setting you can see is your calibration setting, and it's going to be CAL.B, abbreviation for calibration. This is for your analog boost sensor, and it's only for the analog boost sensor. And if you are running that on your harness, that's going to be your black, purple, and yellow wire 3-wire bundle on the harness. Sensor plugs right in. Tubing runs out to the intake to read boost. This is going to be where you can zero that out at atmospheric pressure. And basically what we want to do is make sure that the engine is off, no vacuum or boost is applied to the sensor itself. And we're basically going to do a tare weight on the sensor so that we can zero it out at whatever atmospheric pressure you're at. And so we're going to tap the left button to do that. And it is going to say open air sensor, cal tap 0.1. An open air sensor basically means we want to make sure the sensor is seeing open atmospheric pressure. Either turn your engine off or you can just disconnect the hose from your sensor, but we want to make sure there's no vacuum or boost applied to that sensor. Then it's going to say tap 0.1, tap the left button one more time. The screen's going to do some swirl motions and then a 0.0, and then it's also going to save and exit the menu as well. Now your sensor is zeroed out so that when you start your car and make vacuum, your gauge is starting at the correct atmospheric 0 point to then go down and up based on boost and vacuum. So we can see our next setting is F.SET, and that stands for factory reset. This function is going to bring all these settings that we've gone over back to the default setting when we load software on the gauge. Now that might not be the correct setting for your specific vehicle, as this is going to bring it back to a CC.A and a Boost.D default setting. And there's many cars that need different settings than those to work correctly. So factory resets, I only really suggest when I have a customer who maybe isn't quite sure what all they changed. And rather than have them send all of their settings to me and then we go through those one by one, we can start by just doing a factory reset. Then I already know what all those default settings will be, and then we can adjust as needed after that. So in order to perform a factory reset, you're going to hold the left button down and it's going to say hold. It's going to do that so you can't accidentally bump it. Keep holding till the screen goes blank, and then you might see some dots and a 0 flash. And then again, like before, we've exited the config menu by performing this function. The factory reset is the last function in the menu. And now if you were to not perform the factory reset and tap the right button, it would bring you right back to the top of the list, and then you just cycle back around again. It's a cyclical menu, so if you do accidentally scroll past something, just keep tapping that right button. It'll bring you all the way back around to that same setting again. Hopefully this video has helped you navigate the menu in your V3 gauge. If you have any further questions, or if we missed something, or another V3 related subject, let us know in the comments down below. We appreciate you guys watching these videos. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and share so that other people can learn about their gauges or find out about our gauges. And we'll see you in the next one. Thanks, guys.